My name's Judy Adair. I'm a member of council of the National Secular Society, and I've never met anybody who didn't feel fairly passionate about education. After all, we've all been there in at least one context. It became a matter dear to my heart when I was 11 years old. My first day at secondary school, I had a letter to take to the head teacher saying that I was to be withdrawn from religious instruction. And he smiled down at me benignly and said, "Oh, so what religion are you, Judith?" And I'll never forget the horrified look on his face when I said, "I'm an atheist, sir." So my card was marked from that day on in that school, unfortunately. So I'm delighted to be presenting this session, and our two speakers are Stephen Evans, who is our campaigns director in the NSS. I won't go into his biography, you all have it in front of you, but Stephen has taken a particular interest in education from a number of perspectives, being a governor as well as through his work at the NSS. And Paul Rowe, who is the Chief Executive of Educate Together, which is an inclusive education charity. We at the NSS have been very impressed with the work of that organisation, so much so that we granted them the Secularist of the Year award this year. So Stephen will speak first, followed by Paul, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So over to you, Stephen.
All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, I'm sure most of you here will be aware that it's the role of religion in schools that's probably one of the most contested and controversial areas of public policy in the UK. I've been working for the NSS now for several years, and a big part of the work we do, which is often unseen, is providing advice and assistance to parents, usually, who turn to us for help. And by far the number one issue on the emails, the telephone calls that we receive from members of the public is faith schools and the role of religion in schools more generally, not only in faith schools. These issues are wide-ranging. They include, for example, tensions arising from compulsory worship, religion being imposed in schools, doctrine taught as fact, students being left vulnerable to extremist influences, pupils and teachers facing religious discrimination in both admissions and in employment, and increasingly parents frustrated at having no option other than a faith school for their child. And so it seems to me that it's in our state education system where a lack of secularism most directly impinges on the rights of ordinary British people, but also wider society. Hopefully you'll all have seen a copy of our Rethinking Religion in Public Life report. And a significant part of this report does focus on education policy because it's in this area where organised religion still maintains massive, significant influence, not seen in any other area of public policy. And in the terms of today's conference, in the theme of today's conference, Better Living Together, I'd argue that it's quite a pernicious influence. For those of you unfamiliar with the educational landscape in the UK, let me just quickly take a little bit of time to give a brief overview of where we're at. In England and Wales, a third of state schools are legally designated as having a religious character. These include Church of England, Church in Wales, Roman Catholic, Jewish, Methodist schools. And since 1998, Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim state schools have also opened, as well as an increase in number of Christian schools of no specific religious denomination. Academisation in England has also seen the introduction of faith ethos schools. These are academies and free schools that aren't legally registered as having a religious character, but nonetheless seek to transmit a faith ethos all the same. Scotland is still divided by denominational and non-denominational schools. There are around 370 state-funded faith schools in Scotland. That's around 20% of the total. Almost all of those are Roman Catholic. But the non-denominational schools are far from secular, widely regarded as being Protestant in ethos. In Northern Ireland, shamefully, most children still attend largely religiously separated schools. The situation has been criticised recently by the United Nations Commission on the Rights of the Child, which called for Northern Ireland to move towards a fully integrated system to facilitate social integration, but nowhere near enough progress has been made there clearly. The UK is somewhat unique in the way it funds religious schools and includes them in state education system. It's not at all common across Europe or indeed the rest of the world. This is largely on account of the fact that churches were amongst the first providers of schools in the UK and so have remained part of the landscape ever since. Religious schools have been allowed to continue without any real serious thought and have been extended more recently, as I said, to minority faiths, not because of any real political or public support, but simply because to fund one type of school, church schools, but not other kinds of schools, would clearly be discriminatory. And it's remarkable that myself and colleagues at the NSS have been discussing faith schools with MPs, ministers, even secretaries of state. They often say, well, of course we wouldn't start from here, but we are where we are. So their support for faith schooling, although seemingly unmovable, it is at the same time somewhat lukewarm, but lacking the political will to disrupt the status quo, faith schooling persists. But the continuing presence of publicly funded church schools has very much paved the way for the growth of minority faith schools and the potential for social division that stems from this multiculturalist approach. Perhaps the most talked about issue with faith schools is admissions and the way in which some faith schools discriminate and select pupils on the basis of their religion. Generally speaking, of course, discrimination on the grounds of religion belief is unlawful, but not in our education system, thanks to a legal exemption lobbied for and won by the churches that enables some religious schools to select pupils on the basis of their faith, or more accurately, their parents' willingness to attend church services. Around 1.2 million school places across England and Wales are subject to religious selection when oversubscribed, so that's not at all a trivial issue. I believe the UK, the Republic of Ireland, Estonia, and Israel, I think, are the only countries that discriminate in admissions in this way. And clearly this sort of discrimination is at odds with a society based around principles of fairness and equality, qualities you would hope our education system would espouse. At the NSS, we believe young people's access to the schools that we all pay for should never be determined by their parents' religious beliefs or activities. But it's not only children and their families that are the victims of faith schools' eagerness to discriminate. Teachers often find themselves blocked from certain positions in faith schools, particularly leadership positions, or in some cases disciplined because they fail to be sufficiently pious or perhaps they're of the wrong sexual orientation. Teachers often find themselves blocked from posts in this way. But it's not only religious discrimination that we're seeing going on these days. We recently identified Islamic faith schools unlawfully discriminating on grounds of gender, schools advertising for male science teachers, an Islamic school insisting on female-only teachers. The arrival of Islamic schools has seen the introduction of gender segregation, not on educational grounds, which of course has been a long part of the education system in the UK, but now on religious grounds, and I think that is something different. After passing on our findings to the DfE, 3 Muslim schools were ordered to obey the law, but of course these issues only really get dealt with when issues such as ourselves uncover the malpractice, and who knows what's going on the rest of the time. Which brings me to what's getting taught in these schools and the ways in which teaching can undermine parents' rights, children's rights, and social cohesion. And here, it's not only faith schools that are the problem. As you'll see, the law requires all schools to provide a daily act of Christian worship. The Christian bit can be replaced by worship of another religion, if that's felt more appropriate by the school's governors. Some of the schools in the Trojan Horse Affair actually were doing this, replacing the Christian worship with Islamic worship, sometimes with permission of the local authority, sometimes not. Of course, many non-faith schools ignore the worship requirement, but it's true to say that many don't. And where schools do impose worship, it causes unnecessary resentment, it impedes children's religious freedoms, and it interferes with parents' rights to give their child the upbringing they choose. Parents do have the right to withdraw, but these opt-outs are seldom taken up, partly because of low awareness of them, and partly because lots of parents don't actually know what's going on in their school. Children are well known for not passing on too much information to their parents about what they've been doing at school. So lots of parents just don't know it's going on. But parents also that do know that it's going on and don't like it simply don't want to draw attention to their children, see them singled out or excluded from any part of the school day. Also, withdrawal isn't often sensitively handled by schools. Schools usually have absolutely no alternative activity for opted-out children, and we've seen cases of pupils being told to sharpen pencils, tidy the classroom, or sit on a mat outside the headmaster's office, which often feels more like punishment to the children. But in faith schools, including church schools, religion, of course, permeates all aspects of school life. There is no escape. Those running faith schools often regard these educational establishments as religious institutions, very much in the business of indoctrinating children with a particular faith. Until recently, church schools never used to really push their religion particularly hard, certainly not in modern times. But these days, the Church of England membership is in free fall. We're seeing rapidly declining and aging church congregations. And the church these days very much sees schools as its only hope of securing its next generation of believers. Priests are becoming regular visitors, classroom worship is being introduced, prayer corners are being set up in all classrooms, religious symbols erected. As the former chair of the Church of England's Board of Education said, we don't need to attract children or young people to church. They're already here if we embrace our church schools fully. Of course, this was the same bishop who suggested that to fully exploit the opportunity they have to evangelize, clergy should set up camp beds in every church school. I kid you not. Of course, other religious groups have now recognized that having their own schools paid for by the state is the best way to ensure their next generation of believers. Children's freedom to make their own reflective choices don't seem to get a look in when faith groups come knocking for public money to open schools. In minority faith schools, we often see the rights of individual students subsumed into the forced homogeneity of community and cultural identities. When taken to extreme, as we have seen in some minority schools, an emphasis on group culture has allowed communities to enforce their values and traditions upon children. Following investigations by the NSS, we've seen the Jewish, yesterday, Hatorah school in East London being rebuked, a girls' school, being rebuked by the exam regulator, Ofqual, for censoring questions relating to human reproduction and evolution on exam papers. Nevertheless, the school defiantly continues to shield young girls from vital scientific knowledge about their bodies, and now the school simply advises students not to answer the exam questions which conflict with the school's strict orthodox religious ethos. But this school's attitude is indicative, I think, of a wider problem of faith-based schools narrowing the curriculum to suit their own particular religious ethos. The situation for young people is even worse in the independent sector, where children are being left to languish in substandard schools, more akin to indoctrination centres, and often in unregistered and illegal schools. And these children, I would argue, are the victims of the racism of low expectations. They deserve better. We've been raising these concerns for years, but only now are our concerns finally being addressed, and that's because they're being addressed in a security context rather than a child's rights context. But back in the maintained sector, with England facing a shortage of school places, a chronic shortage of school places, but increasingly seeing pupils being allocated faith schools against their parents' wishes. This has long been the case, of course, in rural areas where the church school is often the only school in the village. But we're now seeing children in towns and cities also being forced into faith schools. And in the last couple of years, we've assisted an increasing number of parents facing this dilemma. In one case, we assisted 20 parents of various faith and belief backgrounds, including Christians and atheists, who were allocated places at a Sikh free school in Buckinghamshire. We assisted a Muslim parent in Leeds who wanted a secular education for her daughter, but was instead allocated by her local authority a place in an Orthodox Jewish school, because it was the only school with places available. And in most cases, alternative provision has been found after numerous appeals to local authority. But recently, we've been made aware of cases where this isn't the case, and no alternative provision can be offered. Children's religious freedoms and parental rights can only really be properly respected in a multiculturalist society, in a multi-faith society, by a shift away from faith-based schooling in favour of inclusive and secular schooling, where children of all faith backgrounds and none are educated together and the values promoted are universal rather than being religious-specific. Of course, we need to ensure that parents' religious and philosophical convictions are respected in the education that the state provides. Article 2 of the Human Rights Act demands this. But the demand for a faith-based education, wholly on orthodox parents' terms, is unreasonable, and it's a potentially divisive demand which we need to resist. So, what's standing in the way of secular reforms? A little slide showing the progress we've made in recent years. It's quite depressing. In the last 70 years, it's been 70 years now, I think, since the role of religion in state education last received any serious legislative attention. Britain's religion and belief landscape, of course, has changed dramatically in that time. But our education system appears fossilised, stuck in 1944, when the current educational settlement between church and state was originally put in place. Clearly, it's high time for a radical rethink, but progress in this particular area of education is much slower than in other areas of public policy. And the reason why, I think, is quite straightforward. It's faith schools. Faith schools constitute an extremely powerful lobby, as do the national religious organisations. The Church of England, with its bishops in the Lords, privileged access to the corridors of power, defends faith schools as if its life depends upon it, probably because it does. It's also argued by those defending faith schools that parents really want faith schools, and so the state has a duty to provide them. But actually, it's not at all clear that parents really do want faith schools. Polling suggests that few parents actually choose a school based on religious criteria. Most parents simply want just good schools. They tolerate the religious bit. Another recent poll found 2/3 of Muslim parents wouldn't opt for the Muslim state school if given the choice. So I'm not clear there's any real demand for faith schooling out there from parents. I think any demand is coming from religious organisations. But there are reasons to be optimistic. Generally speaking, there's very little public support for faith schools. Polling consistently shows fairly widespread opposition. Britain's changing demographics, in which we're seeing religious adherence diminishing and at the same time diversifying, means the multiculturalist, multi-faithist approach to education is steadily becoming less tenable and far less attractive, and perhaps it's only a matter of time now before politicians stop seeing these issues as a can of worms too contentious to tackle and decide to face up to them and introduce some kind of reforms. And there does seem to be a growing consensus behind what we at the NSS have been calling for decades. Some good news recently from the UN. The UN Committee on the United Nations, Committee on the Rights of the Child, urged the UK to repeal laws requiring broadly Christian worship. It also called for pupils to be given the independent right of withdrawal from any religious worship that's held in schools, something we've been campaigning on for years. And the UN's observations follow submission from the NSS along those lines. So at last, compulsory worship is being seen as the human rights violation that it is. The former Education Secretary, Charles Clarke, has also published an education policy proposal with Linda Woodhead, a British academic specialising in the sociology of religion. They've called for a review into the current educational settlement, dating back from 1944, and they advise that the current requirement in statute for an act of collective worship should be abolished. Their report didn't go far enough, though. Unfortunately, it failed to recommend a move away from faith schools, but it did call for fairer admission procedures and was critical of the arrangements which enable faith schools to select teachers on the basis of religion. There's more. An academic evaluation of religious observance in schools by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, published just last year, also struggled to find any rationale for collective worship, because, of course, there is no credible rationale for compelling people to take part in religious rituals. Also on our side, we've got the National Association of School Governors. They've also called for an end to school worship, pointing out that few schools actually obey the law in full, but where they do, parental rights and pupils' religious freedoms are being undermined. The Trojan Horse affair in Birmingham also shone a spotlight on the ways schools are being used to immerse pupils in orthodox Islamic doctrine. This has led to a greater scrutiny of faith schools, which again is to be welcomed, although again is often in a security context rather than a child's rights context, I think, which is unfortunate. Another possible positive I could mention is the development, the arrival in Britain of Educate Together, and Paul will tell you more about their work next. but they're the school provider that's putting secularist principles into action. So I think there is cause for optimism. But to finish, I just want to come back to the theme of today's conference, of living better together. And it seems quite obvious to me that if we're going to create a more cohesive, integrated and tolerant society where people of all faiths and none can live together well, educating children together, is essential. Logic dictates and experience tells us that where children learn together, they learn to live together. And I see it every day with my own children, in a community school where children of all faith backgrounds and none learn together and they play together. Of course, recognising their differences, but not being divided by them. It's also become clear to me, and research again backs this up, that children's friendships also foster integration between parents of different faiths, breaking down the barriers that can so easily lead to ignorance and bigotry. On the other hand, a school system that encourages children to be segregated along religious lines, and sometimes ethnic lines, in schools organised around religious identities, can only spell disaster for social cohesion. Now, nobody's pretending that the secular education system is a panacea to cure all ills, but it is a necessary step to ensuring freedom, fairness, and human rights are respected through state education, and can only help us as a society to live better together. Thank you.